Dear YouTube community, this is the story of the horrific crimes of Joseph Stalin, a dictator who led the Soviet Union. The horrific acts are many and are filled with suffering and death. Please subscribe and like the video. The brutality of Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was a dictator who led the Soviet Union from the mid-1920s until 1953. As General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and Premier of the Soviet Union, accounts of Joseph Stalin's horrific acts are many. The list is long, painful to recite, and plagued by untold suffering and death. Stalin increased his power as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the early 1920s, following the Russian Revolution. Subsequently, he became the undisputed and de facto dictator of the Soviet Union and was shockingly ruthless when it came to murdering his own people. Stalin is often compared to Adolf Hitler, who murdered some 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. In the Ottoman Empire during the early 20th century, its leaders carried out a quasi-genocide of millions of Armenians. Many millions died as a result of Japanese war crimes during World War II. Under the command of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and Emperor Hirohito. Even in the Soviet Union, Stalin's predecessor, Vladimir Lenin, was relentless in leading his party through a brutal revolution that claimed nearly 9 million lives. Stalin clearly takes his place among the most murderous ideologues in history. The death toll under Stalin's regime, what became known as Stalinism, is somewhat controversial. Given the secrecy and often the lack of precision in records during his reign of terror. However, by his direct order, millions of people in the Soviet Union were executed, and many more perished in labor camps. Millions more died of hunger due to his ill-conceived and often deliberately cruel policies. Below are 7 of the most atrocious acts he committed. Lenin founded the Gulag, an acronym for Main Administration of Collective Labor Camps, the network of prisons and forced labor camps throughout the Soviet Union, but it was Stalin who employed them for his most atrocious and at least semi-effective purposes. The camps, like prisons around the world, were used to house criminals. The primary purpose of the Gulag, however, was to gain control of the population through fear imprisoning, torturing, and killing undesirables, critics of communism, and anyone who challenged Stalin to drag the Soviet Union from its agrarian past toward an industrialized society. More than 3.7 million Soviet citizens were forced into the camps, many in the most remote and arid areas of the country, between 1931 to 1953, according to one report. Nearly 800,000 of them were shot. The Gulag population reached its highest numbers in the early 1950s, with approximately 2.5 million inmates. Between 12 and 14 million people in total passed through its gates between 1934 and 1944 alone, and no fewer than 1.5 million people died in the Gulag between 1930 and 1956. The Gulag eventually numbered nearly 500 camps at one point. More people passed through the Gulag system for much longer than those imprisoned in Nazi Germany's concentration camps throughout their entire existence. The purpose of the Gulag was not to kill people. It was designed to discipline society. It is really about social control. The famous Russian poet and writer, Osip Mandelstam, was arrested twice and sent to the Gulag, the first time in 1933, for a poem that characterized Stalin as a jovial murderer from approximately 1929 to 1932. In the name of promoting communism and strengthening his control over the state, Stalin confiscated the lands and properties of millions of peasant families and forced them to abandon their properties, many of them ending up in the Gulag. These people, the kulaks, were the wealthiest of the peasant class and were seen as a direct threat to Stalin's rule. So they were dispossessed, many were killed, and the rest were exiled and forced to work on collective farms or in Juliches in mining or construction, where millions more died. Stalin, concerned about subversive elements within Soviet borders, also ordered the forced resettlements of entire populations, people of specific nationalities living in the Soviet Union who were deported or moved to remote areas who were deported or moved to remote to what some call spectral with spectral fertilities. What special precept to bell with metwell and with slet we will bellow with we will let be what we will ep or what we will but we don't want if I what to why with we will why with what if we were with whatever With his policy of decolonization, Stalin effectively eliminated an entire class, severely damaging the agricultural sector of the economy, which contributed to millions more dying in the Great Famine. More on that chapter below. Around 14.5 million people died of hunger in the Great Famine of 1932 to 1933, also known as the Holodomor. Estimates of the death toll vary widely, but it is generally accepted that millions perished. Ukraine and Kazakhstan were particularly hard hit, and unlike other famines where drought was the primary cause, it was Stalin's policies toward industrialization and the move away from food production on small farms that contributed to this disaster. Furthermore, Stalin used food shortages strategically, ensuring that certain areas were more affected than others. He shamelessly welcomed many of the deaths, especially when it came to enemies of the state, kulaks and idlers, or those who did not work on the collective farms. He quoted Lenin by saying, "He who does not work, does not eat." Many consider the Great Famine nothing less than genocide and blame Stalin directly. For a series of reasons, the Holocaust must be considered the worst case of genocide of the modern era. Nonetheless, the points of comparison between Stalin and Hitler, Nazism and Stalinism, are too many to ignore. Both were dictators who killed a vast number of people on the European continent. Both crushed the lives of human beings in the name of a transformative vision of utopia. Both destroyed their countries and societies, as well as a large number of people inside and outside their own states. Both, in the end, were genocidal. In 1936, Stalin initiated the Great Purge, with the goal of ridding the Communist Party of some of its greatest detractors and rivals. Hundreds of thousands of people were initially arrested by Stalin's NKVD, the secret police. Many were executed or sent to the Gulag. Of the 103 highest-ranking members of the Communist Party, 81 were executed. Eventually, more than a third of the Communist Party died during the Great Purge, which also had the effect of terrorizing the general population. Many people turned against friends and family in an attempt to save themselves from the Gulag or certain death. In the end, not even the head of the NKVD, Nikolai Yezhov, was spared. He was executed in 1940. But powerful NKVD policemen like Yezhov did not just disappear from life, they also disappeared from photos. Stalin understood the historical value of photographs and how to use them for propaganda. Stalin went to the extreme of using photo retouchers to erase his enemies from photographs, including Yezhov, who was essentially eliminated from the historical record. Stalin's brutality did not stop with civilians and enemies of the Communist Party. It extended to the very people fighting for him and for the country. In 1942, as the Germans fought their way towards Stalingrad in the early days of World War II, Stalin issued one of his best-known and cold-blooded edicts, Order No. 227. It declared that panic mongers and cowards must be liquidated on the spot. The order also called for penal battalions. Soldiers with minor offenses were sent to the front lines and blocking units at the rear of the line to prevent cowards from retreating. It is unclear how many Soviet soldiers died at the hands of their own comrades under Stalin's order. In another famous order, Stalin said, "We have no prisoners of war, only traitors to the motherland." Unlike prisoners of war from other Allied countries, Soviets who survived Hitler's camps did not return to their homeland after the war as liberated heroes. Many suffered forced repatriation, while others managed to remain in the West, including quite a few war criminals. Since Stalin distrusted Red Army members who had been captured, most Soviet prisoners of war went directly from German concentration camps to the Gulag archipelago camps. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were interrogated upon their return. Approximately half were sent to the Gulag, and many thousands were shot or otherwise died at the hands of their compatriots. Although Stalin sent thousands of his own Soviet prisoners of war to their deaths, he turned a blind eye to the behavior of his soldiers on the battlefield. If they fought admirably, that is, if they won battles, Stalin did not bother with how they did it or the subsequent consequences. After hearing reports that Soviet soldiers were raping women in Germany and elsewhere, he is said to have commented, "What is so terrible about him having fun with a woman after such horrors?" Stalin continued to lead the Soviet Union with an iron fist for most of his life. The Gulag, in fact, still held about 2.5 million inmates in 1953, the year he died. But the Gulag and Stalinism crumbled after his death. The state of terror that Stalin built was dismantled very quickly by his successors. One of the reasons was that it was highly inefficient. Putting so many people in prison, even if you make them work, is not a great way to run your country. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin are seen at the Crimea Conference, where they discussed post-war reorganization. Communism was about achieving an ideal society by mobilizing forces to produce a just society. Stalin and his Communist Party were not so much about repression, Payne says, as they were about building that utopia Neymark mentions. Although Stalin is hailed by some for helping to defeat Nazi Germany, it should not be forgotten that in August 1939, he signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler which, a week after the pact was formalized, allowed Germany to invade Poland, effectively starting World War II. The agreement also contained a plan to divide Europe between the two powers. The pact was broken in June 1941 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union.